So the talk today is about how we resist conventional wisdom. And we often think of conventional wisdom as a good thing, and in many ways it is. But if you want to innovate, if you want to invent, if you want to have independent thinking, then conventional wisdom can be kind of the enemy. So how do we deal with that? I think one of the ways that we resist conventional wisdom, and by that we innovate or we move forward in a new way, is that we use our intuition. And really today we want to talk significantly about intuition as a way of resisting conventional wisdom and how we train our intuition. We get an educated intuition that allows us to have insights that counterbalance conventional wisdom and give us the confidence to move ahead with a new direction. So I want to tell a couple of stories at the beginning here of what is this educated intuition. So the first is about a piece of art that was going to be acquired by the Getty Museum. And this was probably 30 years ago. The Getty Museum was just beginning in Los Angeles. J. Paul Getty had given billions of dollars in today's money to create this museum when he died. And they had lots of money to buy artworks of all sorts all over the world. And so they were looking at a particularly unique piece of art that was going to be a centerpiece of their collection. It was what's called a kouros, which is a standing male. It was a piece of Greek sculpture, ancient sculpture, 2,000 years old. It's a nude male figure that stands rather straight like this. And there are a number of these kouroses in major museums, in the Metropolitan Museum in New York or in the Louvre in Paris. But here was one that was available, and the Getty Museum wanted to purchase it, and it was going to be a real prize for them. So of course they did all the due diligence to make sure it was authentic. They got the provenance of it, and they could get that from the 1930s, and that means that it's a record of exactly who owned it and how long they owned it, and then who they sold it to and how long they owned it, and you could make sure that it really went back to an authentic piece of art. So that they had all of that very well documented. And then they also had scientists test it. And they tested, they had a geologist who came in and did a kind of chemical analysis on the surface of the kouros. Also analyzed it with microscopes and looked at exactly its structure there. Had it weathered really for thousands of years, or you know, what was that surface like? They also did a core, so they actually drilled in and took a little core of it out, and to find out if it really was the age stone it needed to be. And then they also did another kind of calcite analysis, which is a kind of growth on the outside of the sculpture, and it takes hundreds of years for the calcite to form, and so they needed to make sure there was a sufficient layer of calcite to prove that it really was an ancient piece of art. So they did all of that. They used all the science, all the conventional wisdom that told you this is an authentic piece of art. They were spending $10 million for it. It was a big deal. They were going to have it as a centerpiece of the museum. They wanted to make sure they were right. And conventional wisdom told them, yes, you are right. But there was this guy named Thomas Hoving, who is an art historian. And Thomas Hoving had this just intuition that they asked him to come and look at this kouros they were about to purchase. And I don't know, it just didn't seem right to him. He felt the fingernails were a little odd on it. He felt like it had a kind of freshness. And they said, what do you mean freshness? Well, I don't know exactly. It just doesn't feel right. And that's all they could say. And so they couldn't take that as fact. That was just intuition. So science was fact. This was just intuition. They negated that. And they bought the piece. And there was a big article on the front page of the New York Times about it, and this became a real feature of the Getty Museum. Then about a decade later, there began to be some questions about the provenance. Part of it had been typed with a typewriter, that if that really was a 1942 document, that typewriter wasn't invented until 1955, so wait, that doesn't work. And they began to investigate more and more, and slowly, the whole thing fell apart. They said, well, what about this calcite formation? But then it turned out that they figured out that you could use potato mold to speed up the growth of calcite on that particular stone. And so the whole thing fell apart. And it's generally accepted now that it's a fake. And it's been a fake a long time. It wasn't the person who sold it to him didn't fake it. It was probably fake back then in the 1930s, and everybody's been duped since then. But conventional wisdom said you use provenance and use science, and you can be sure that you're getting an authentic work of art. Whereas Thomas Hoving just had educated intuition, but he is an expert. He knew Greek art, and something just told him that wasn't right. Another similar kind of example. There is a great well-known tennis coach named Vic Braden. And Vic Braden had the unique capability of being able to tell whether a tennis player was going to double fault. And he could tell it before the tennis racket ever hit the ball. He could just look at how the tennis player wound up, how they sent the racket into the air, and before it hit the ball, he could say double fault. And he got it right 20 out of 20 times. I mean, he was just virtually perfect at being able to tell that. And he didn't even know how he could tell. Is it the wrist? He didn't know. But he could tell every time if someone was going to double fault. And people don't double fault that often, so I think 5% of the time people double fault. But he knew it every time that was going to happen. That was just educated intuition, an expert who just knows something like that. Now, both of those examples are from a book by Malcolm Gladwell called Blink. And he calls this adaptive unconscious. And we're reading Malcolm Gladwell this week, so this is germane. But he talks about adaptive unconscious. I would call that educated intuition. But there are some things we're conscious and deliberate about, and maybe there's some things that we're just intuitive about. And maybe a way to counterbalance conventional wisdom is to listen more to our intuition. Especially if we're knowledgeable about something, we maybe need to listen to our intuition. And I would say that's often a source of creativity. Someone like Jane Goodall, she grew up with animals, she loved animals, she actually had educated herself about animals. And even by the time she's 20 years old, she has an intuition that there's more to these animals. They have a life in their head. They have empathy, they have feelings, they have, there's more here than we understand. But that was just an intuition. Science said they're dumb animals. They can't think. They don't have these sophisticated emotions. And that it was her educated intuition that allowed her to broach conventional wisdom and to then start a whole career that proved that her intuition was right. A similar thing with Temple Grandin, who she had this intuition that, these cows are in great distress, and you could make them calmer, and you could be more understanding of the way they feel while you're herding them and wrangling them. And conventional wisdom said they're just dumb animals. We just get them from point A to point B. This is the way we've always done it. And it was the way we've always done it. But Temple Grandin said, no, if we get inside their head and we really understand it, we can design an environment where they can go through the same process, but without the kind of angst and turmoil and sometimes violence that happens when that isn't understood. This is the way that educated intuition can be a counterbalance to conventional wisdom and be a spark for creativity. Now, I want us to look in some depth at two examples of this today. The first example is this guy, Bill Stumpf. Bill Stumpf was a furniture designer in the 1970s and 80s into the 90s. And he was an expert. He had designed some really cool office chairs. One was called Ergon and one was called Equa. And both of those were very popular. They'd been big sellers. Herman Miller carried both of those chairs. They're a big office furniture manufacturer. And Bill Stumpf was their man. And they really loved his work and respected his work. And they were listening to this guy. This guy was an expert in office furniture. And then in the 1990s, he was designing a new chair. And he wanted to design a really perfect office chair. And at that point, there were kind of two kinds of office chairs. There were secretarial chairs like these, and they were very simple, no arms on them, not too cushy, not too big, wheels on them, they could move around. And then there were executive chairs like this. They're like big, fat, leathery looking, soft, plush chairs. They swiveled and they moved on wheels like the secretarial chairs, but had a completely different look and feel to them. And so he said, you know something, these days, organizations are getting flatter, less hierarchical. Do we really need to have executive chairs and secretarial chairs? Don't we all have the same bodies? Shouldn't we be thinking of comfort and ergonomics and efficiency? And why do we need that kind of chair and this kind of chair? Why don't we just have one chair that is just right for whatever task you're doing and whatever position you have in the company? So he's looking to design the kind of universal chair. And this chair was meant to be based on a lot of knowledge and intuition he had, and a lot of experience he could bring, and a lot of intuition he felt about designing a chair. And this is the chair that came out of that. And this chair is the most popular chair for work environment that has ever been produced. It is phenomenally successful financially and in virtually every way. So you've seen that chair, I'm sure, many, many times. There are a zillion rip-offs of that chair. But there really were 4 things that were generating the character of that chair. The first is this notion of leveling, so that it's going to have some characteristics of an executive chair and some characteristics of a secretarial chair, but it's going to be universal, and it's going to make everybody equal in the office. Now, that was completely against conventional wisdom, but his intuition was that that's the way offices are going, and that's a fairer, more just way to allocate furniture in an office. Then there were 3 other things that were conventional wisdom that he felt like were wrong here. One is that in a chair, there was always a pivot that was just like a hinge between the back and the seat. So there was just a hinge there like that. And there was the notion that that's exactly the way your body works. There's a hinge at your hip. But he had done enough study of physiology and the way the body is built to realize that actually that's not true, that our hip is a very complex joint, and it isn't like a simple hinge like that, that it actually moves in a much more irregular way. And so he created this very complicated device in here where the seat and the back do not have a simple hinge, that they move independently of each other. And it's why when you sit in a regular chair and you sit there for a long time during the day and your shirt tail comes out, that's because your body is not moving in the same way the chair is moving. And that was his first hint. But he said, can we make a chair where the joint is like your hip joint? And that when you're in that chair, the back and the seat are moving relative to each other in the very same way that your back and your butt move relative to each other when you move your body. So the first thing was this completely different pivot between the seat and the back. The second thing is most office chairs, pretty much all office chairs, had the arms attached to the seat. I'm not sure why that was, but yeah, pretty much all office chairs, if they had arms, the arms were attached to the seat. But he said that's crazy because our arms are attached to our back. They're not attached to our legs and our seat. So they should be attached to the piece that it is for our upper body. So he made the arms attached to the back instead of the arms attached to the seat. That was, again, completely against conventional wisdom. Pretty much every office chair in the world had the arms attached to the seat. And then the fourth thing was pretty much all office chairs had a kind of soft padded surface. Even if it was a secretarial chair, there would be some kind of fabric or sometimes plastic or naugahyde or leather, but some kind of padded surface that interfaced with your body. But he thought, no, sometimes your body heat builds up and you get a little sweaty, and that's very uncomfortable against that surface. No, you need something that would breathe and that would be very, very light and thin, but that would be pliable so that it could give with your body. And so he invented this kind of mesh that worked to do that. So he changed the hinge and the joint. He moved the arms to the back rather than the seat. He made this new kind of support fabric. He also took the chair much taller on the back so that it would support your shoulders and not just your back. That was quite a change from a regular, especially secretarial chair. And he made this elastic mesh that breathed was meant to be much more comfortable to sit in for long periods of time. And especially as people in this period of time were beginning to do much more work at a computer. They were at their desk a lot more. And he needed to have this so it could be comfortable for 8 hours a day. So he's designing this in the beginning of the 1990s. And in May of 1992, he made his first prototypes. And he took them out into the marketplace. And the way that, again, conventional wisdom, the way you figure out whether you've got a successful chair or not is that you have all these study groups that look at the chair and they sit in the chair, or they give it to you to sit in your office for a couple of weeks. And these test groups then give feedback about the success of the chair. And again, that's conventional wisdom. That's how Herman Miller evaluates whether they want to put a chair into production or not. And they generally would score it on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is really good and 1 sucks. And so they generally think if it gets a 7.5, we'll take it into production. And generally they score it independently on comfort and on aesthetics. So what does it score on comfort? What is it on aesthetics? The first time around, this chair got a 4.75. It failed miserably. Both on aesthetics and on comfort, it sucked. They kept, kind of tweaking it a little bit and sending it to a different group. They thought, maybe we just made a mistake in the testing. They sent it out again. If they sent it to just the right people, they could get the comfort up to an 8, but the aesthetics never got above a 5. People just thought it was ugly. Looked like some kind of insect. And mostly the aesthetics were between 2 and 3. It was just deemed to be completely unacceptable. They had focus groups and talked to them about it. The architects kind of liked it. They thought it was cool looking. The facilities people who bought most office chairs thought it was horrible and just rated it extremely, extremely low. Now, if you're Herman Miller, what do? Well, because this guy was such an expert and Bill Stump was their man, he convinced them to go ahead and take the chair into production. And so they did. And they began to try to sell the chair. And at the beginning, it didn't sell well at all. Most people looked at it and said, it is ugly. And they wouldn't even give it a shot. They did a few placements in films. So a Cool Office, they managed to get this chair in that film. Some architects used it in their offices. Sometimes other kind of avant-garde groups would use it, adventuresome groups. But for the most part, this is not selling like Herman Miller products normally do. It's very slow sales. And then it turned out that by the end of the 1990s, sales were growing by about 50% a year. And then by the beginning of the 2000s, sales are growing by 70% a year. And it just took off. And before long, this was the largest selling office chair that Herman Miller had. And then it got to be the largest selling office chair in the world. And then it got ripped off and it got to be ubiquitous in offices everywhere. And now people think, of course the arm should be on the back. Of course there should be a mesh so that you don't get hot and sweaty on your back by your body heat against some kind of upholstered surface. Of course there should be a more complicated relationship than a hinge joint between the seat and the back. And even chairs that don't look like that, the fundamental principles became ubiquitous. They became conventional wisdom. But all of this started with Bill Stump and Bill Stump's educated intuition about reinventing the office chair. That what we've been doing is completely wrong and we should rethink this. What an incredible creative act. But if he'd believed in conventional wisdom, we'd never have this most popular chair that's ever been produced. Okay, let's look at another example of conventional wisdom being violated in favor of a kind of intuition in a different direction. We're going to be looking for a few minutes at the experience of Abraham Lincoln when he got elected president. And he was actually a very, very unlikely candidate for president. Abraham Lincoln had been a one-term congressman from Illinois. He had lost the race for the Senate twice. He was a country lawyer from Springfield, not even from Chicago, not from a major city. He was tall, he was gangly, he was unkempt. This was not a likely candidate for president. But in the 1960 presidential election, there were some really good candidates for president. Probably the man was William Seward. He had been 2 terms the governor of New York. He had been a senator for 12 years, so he'd been in Washington. He married into a prominent political family, and everybody knew him, and he had tremendous connections everywhere. He had been the leader of the Whig Party. Up until that, there had been the Whig Party and the Democrats. And if it had stayed that way, there's no doubt William Seward would have been the nominee of the Whig Party. But just before this, the Whig Party kind of fell apart and got reformed as the Republican Party. So he really was the leader of the party that kind of turned into the Republican Party, but it wasn't a sure thing in quite the same way in 1860. So a second person was Salmon Chase. This is, he's Hollywood's version of the perfect Politico. He's 6 feet tall, he's handsome, he's dignified. He's the governor of Ohio. He had been the primary founder of the Republican Party. So he was kind of the darling of this new party that had been formed. And he's staunchly anti-slavery. Now, slavery is the big issue in that 1960 election. And that's part of what created the reforming of the Whig Party, was the fact that there were still some Whigs who wanted slavery. And they needed a new party that was completely anti-slavery. And the Republican Party became that. Then a third person who was a very good candidate was Edward Bates. He's a incredible guy who had 17 children. He was widely respected as a judge in St. Louis. The Missouri Compromise had, of course, been in the state of Missouri, where St. Louis is. He'd been an important part of this settlement of slavery and anti-slavery among the states in the immediate decade before. He had been a former slave owner who had emancipated his slaves, and he was neither a radical abolitionist nor a pro-slavery fanatic. So he was against slavery. He'd emancipated his own slaves, but he could bring in a broader, more moderate group of people that perhaps the others couldn't. So those four are the primary candidates. And in the first ballot, William Seward gets 173 votes, by far the most votes. William Seward's the man, 173 votes. Now, this guy Lincoln is really a candidate at all because the convention is in Chicago. And he's a hometown boy in a certain way. And there were some very loyal people who were supporting him in Chicago. And the head of that group that was pushing for Lincoln was a guy named Lyman Trumbull. And Lyman Trumbull had run for the Senate against Lincoln in 1855, 4 years before. And the first vote, and this was in the days when senators weren't elected by the population, they were elected by the legislature in the state. And so there were 100 legislators in Illinois. It took 51 votes to be elected a senator to go to Washington. And in the first vote, there were 45 for Lincoln, 41 for the Democrats, and 5 for Trumbull. He's an also-ran kind of guy. Lincoln could not get the 51 votes without Trumbull's votes. And Trumbull was anti-slavery like Lincoln was, but he was just a really hard-headed guy. And he would not release his votes to go to Lincoln. So they keep balloting and balloting, and Lincoln actually snarfs off a few Democrats. He gets up to 47, but he could not get the 51 needed, and Trumbull wouldn't budge. And those 5 votes were just completely loyal to Trumbull. And miraculously, Lincoln actually says, okay, I want my 47 votes to go to Trumbull. He gives the 47 votes to the guy who has 5 votes. The guy who has 5 votes gets to be the senator. And that was because at a certain point, Lincoln said, this is getting too divisive. I'm not going to risk the fact that maybe the Democrats could win this. I don't see things too differently than Trumbull. We're both anti-slavery. Yeah, you can have it. So Trumbull goes to Washington. So then fast forward 4 years, and we're having the nomination for the Republican Party's candidate for presidency. And it's in Chicago, so this is Trumbull's home state too. And Trumbull organizes the hell out of everybody in Chicago and promotes Lincoln. Promotes Lincoln because he had seen Lincoln in action. What a good guy this was. He's out for the best result. He's not out for his own personal gain. And that meant so much to Trumbull that he got behind him. So in that primary, in that convention, these 4 guys, William Seward's there, and Salmon Chase, and Edward Bates, and Lincoln. And in the first ballot, 173 votes go to Seward, And actually Lincoln gets 102 votes. Trumbull's out there shaking the bushes. That's a lot less than Seward, but that's a lot of votes. And then Chase gets 49 votes, and Bates gets 48 votes. Then it goes to a second ballot. And in the second ballot, Seward does very, very well. Seward gets 184 votes, but Lincoln really advances significantly. And Lincoln gets up to 181 votes. And then in the third ballot, Abraham Lincoln wins the nomination. Now that was just like a freaking miracle. This guy who's a one-term congressman, just, dark horse for sure. Okay, so that's how Lincoln gets elected. Very odd circumstance. Then there's one other player we need to look at here, a guy named Edwin Stanton. Edwin Stanton had run into Lincoln in 1855 also. In this case, Lincoln had been hired as a lawyer for the McCormick Reaper Company in a lawsuit that was supposedly going to be held in Chicago. And so they hired Lincoln as their lawyer just because he was local in Chicago. Then actually the case got moved to Cincinnati, and there was no reason to use Lincoln. But the McCormick Reaper Company didn't tell Lincoln. He continued to prepare the case. Instead, they hired this guy, Edwin Stanton, who was from the East Coast. He was a big-time lawyer. And he went out to Cincinnati and was ready to try the case. Well, Lincoln shows up to try the case, and Stanton shows up to try the case. And Stanton basically embarrasses the hell out of Lincoln and just says, "You country bumpkin lawyer, I got this. I don't want your help. I don't want your input. Get the hell out of here." So Lincoln actually didn't go back to Illinois. He stayed in Cincinnati, and he listened to Stanton try the case, and he was really impressed. This guy's a good lawyer. He's a smart guy. And even though he'd embarrassed the hell out of Lincoln, it was a horrible situation. And he lost this big commission to Stanton. He could have been pissed off, but instead, he just came out of there with a lot of respect for this guy. So, conventional wisdom says, you begin your presidency, Abraham Lincoln, by making a cabinet of your friends, people who will support you, people who like you, people who you want to give favors to. That's who you get in your cabinet. But Lincoln did exactly the opposite of conventional wisdom. He had this intuition, and you can see it in that Senate race, and you can see it in this trial. His intuition was to just do the best, get the right people there, make sure the outcome is right. And my personal, what's good for me, that's really not that important. And so what happens is that Lincoln makes this cabinet where he's the president. William Seward, his archenemy, becomes the Secretary of State. Seward was so pissed after he lost this to Bumpkin Lincoln, he basically wasn't talking to Lincoln. Lincoln goes to him and says, I want you to be the Secretary of State. I think you're incredibly knowledgeable here. You're going to be great at the job. And so William Seward becomes the Secretary of State. Salmon Chase, his other rival for that nomination, becomes the Secretary of Treasury. Edward Bates, his other rival, the four top people that were contenders here, become the President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, and the Attorney General, the very top cabinet positions. And then this Edwin Stanton guy who'd embarrassed him and stolen this case from him as a lawyer, he becomes the Secretary of War, what would be Secretary of Defense now. This is Lincoln denying conventional wisdom and instead going with his intuition. And of course, he became one of the best, if not the best, president of the United States. He got his face carved on Mount Rushmore. He's on the $5 bill. He is this incredibly revered president. But he went against conventional wisdom. He did a very creative job of assembling a cabinet based on an intuition of his that was not common among political people. Now, I want you to think about this. Am I, as an individual, interested in developing an educated intuition, a strong enough hunch or feeling or conviction on my own that I can actually do something that is fundamentally creative, that is fundamentally innovative, and goes against conventional wisdom? And how do we go about getting that educated intuition? We'll talk about that a little more in the check-in. See you.